Hello, you're through the Books Boys. You've got Dean on the line. Who's calling?
This is me.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Howard Kaplan from Los Angeles.
Howard, it's nice of you to call in. I was just talking there about your book, Syrian Sunset. So how lovely that you would call in. Nice coincidence. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I've got a little cold, but that's just winter sniffles. I'm
It's
doing all
winter.
right.
What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Well, it's fantastic that you'd call in. As I say, we were just chatting about your book. We get authors calling in a lot, but a lot of them are, maybe first-time authors and things like that. But you've actually released a number of books already.
Yes, it's six or seven. I'm not exactly sure myself. I forget because there's one of them that's um, not. There isn't a new edition. Some of my books were written. I've been around a while
Hmm.
before computers.
Okay.
So the problem becomes when they want to re-release them, there's no Word file. And you can't do a digital book, Kindle or
Hmm.
iBook without a Word file.
Sure,
So
sure.
they actually have to type the whole book into Word. There's no way to scan it that
Hmm.
works. So I have one of the books that isn't available, but all the rest are either newer. The Syrian Sunset's my latest book,
Sure.
so that one is readily available.
Cool. And why only one that's been skipped? Is it not one that you
Uh
want to get done or?
it just was the other books seemed to fit more together, and
Right.
this one was a little bit it was about I actually would have been in the Soviet Union. I was arrested in Russia when I was in my
Hmm.
20s, and I did an autobiographical novel about that, so it sort of didn't fit with the rest of the Middle East books. So
Right,
I may
okay.
do it still, but it's just
Cool. Well, I mean that's something I wanted to ask you about. So, um, obviously when I read the book, I decided to check you out, read a little bit of info on your website and things like that. And I was surprised you traveled to the Soviet Union to do some manuscript smuggling, by the looks of things.
yes, and I actually did them out of London, so I was in your backyard a bit.
Wow, okay.
uh, I met some people from both British intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and they wanted me. I was in Russia twice. The second time I was arrested. So my career as a spy ended when I was very young. But the first time I brought a roll of microfilm out from Moscow back to Heathrow,
Wow.
and I succeeded in managing to do that.
So we've interviewed people who've written books about spies. I've not interviewed a spy before.
Well, my career was so brief. Although my best story is, I don't know if I can find it really quickly, I'll show you. Excuse me for jumping away. Um, I don't know where I put it. Oh, here it is. I do have it. Now that we're in a visual world, um, this was a copy of The Hobbit, British edition,
Hmm.
Unwin Books. I don't know what that is, but I bet you do. That I bought in the UK,
Hmm.
and I think you can see this now.
Yeah, yeah.
I took into Russia with me. So what do you see here? You see brown splotches
Yeah.
and then writing over with ink. I was
Wow.
taught to write in the book in milk, and the milk then becomes invisible when it dries. And when you come out, which I did in London, you take a regular household iron and you iron the pages, and the milk burns and it's readable. And the ink is just I went over the writing
You
so
went
other
over
people
it
could,
then.
yeah, with
Wow.
the ink, but it became brown enough that you could distinguish it from the background burns, because unlike Legends of Spies, I don't know if it's true or not, who can remember everything, I could not.
But this is fantastic. This is some movie level spy movie stuff, with the secret writing and everything. Fantastic. How
uh,
did you get involved in that?
uh, I started out that I was at Berkeley as an undergraduate, and I met a professor from Columbia University, and it was during the student riot era. And he came to me and said he was going to teach in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
Hmm.
And I was not very good at math, but he made the following suggestion to me. He says, I'll take you with me to Jerusalem for a year and get you in the university. And what makes more sense? 4 years of rioting in Berkeley or 3 years of rioting in Berkeley and 1 year in Jerusalem? So I found the math
Yeah.
compelling. And from there, I traveled because I was just curious to the Arab countries. I was in Lebanon and Syria, and that became, the basis of my interest in Syria to
Hmm.
write the Syrian Sunset
Sure.
about the Syrian civil war. And I joined a group. I guess they were Israeli intelligence people. And they used to train us once a week in things like this milk. And then I went to London and met a few people, and they said, okay, we wanted one guy from the group to bring out the microfilm. We think it's you.
Wow.
So I was crazy enough and young enough that I said, sure, let's do it.
I'd be terrified.
And I did go, and I stayed in the Metropole Hotel in Moscow across from the Bolshoi, which is now the scene of a very wonderful novel that I read recently called A Gentleman in Moscow, which is completely set inside the Metropole Hotel.
Nice. Okay, cool. And apart from your autobiography of your spy encounter, you mentioned that the rest of your books, the rest of your novels are all sort of Middle East based, and that's an area you've studied, right? That's what you're essentially an expert in that now. That's what your area of expertise.
Yes, I think most lives are like this. You meet your partner at a party. If you didn't go to that party, you wouldn't have met that person.
Yeah.
And I just happened to meet this professor at Berkeley and talked to him a bit. And he said, come with me to Jerusalem. So I went, and I just thought the whole, you know, Lebanon was fascinating. Both Lebanon and Syria have a lot of Roman ruins.
Oh,
And
lovely.
I went to Cairo, and some of them quality of the Parthenon, in
Mm-hmm,
Baalbek in
mm-hmm.
eastern Lebanon. And then I went into Syria, and I spent some time in Syria, and I was just amazed by everything I hadn't expected. Syria is about, we talk in miles, so 50 miles from, I think it's about 100 kilometers, something like that, from the ocean. And unbeknownst to me, Damascus is an oasis. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the earth because there's an underground river from Lebanon that goes up and into Damascus, branches off into 7 rivers. And Damascus is a tremendous oasis with beautiful orchards,
Wow.
apricots,
Yeah, yeah.
nuts,
Wow.
about everything you can imagine why we think desert. And it was a caravan stop. You see in the Syrian Sunset, I write a little bit about one of the
Mm-hmm.
old caravan stops. So I just thought it was such a exotic and lesser known uh, area. So I wrote 2 novels about it. The earlier one was The Damascus Cover, which was my first novel. And then I wrote these other Middle Eastern novels in between about Israel and Palestine. And The Syrian Sunset's my last novel. And many years after The Damascus Cover was published, it was filmed out of the UK with Jonathan Rhys Meyers and Sir John Hurt in his final film. And it's around wherever films reside to be rented.
Fantastic. Yeah, I read that online and I'll have to go and watch it now because that's fantastic. And the interest in the Middle East, it's an area I can't say I know a huge amount about it, but I do see that obviously your degree is in Middle East history. Now, I did study history myself, but you mentioned Roman. My degree was in Greek and Roman history and philosophy. So that's what I studied. But Middle Eastern history is not an area that we really got into very much. A little
Well,
bit
all
about
my
it.
novels are, I always like this. They're sort of heavily historical and also very detailed with description.
Hmm.
There are many streets. The main street in Damascus is called the street called Straight, which is the leftover from, I forgot the technical name for it, the main road in a Roman city,
Hmm.
which always, ran through the center of the city and had columns on both
Yeah, yeah,
sides.
yeah.
And you can still see the columns there in various places in Damascus. So uh, I actually, it was another British experience when the editor of my first novel, The Damascus Cover, bought it. I went to New York to see him, and he handed me a book by a British author, Irish, I think he was British, I'm not sure, Gerald Seymour, called Harry's Game, about
Okay.
Northern Ireland.
Ah, right where
It's
I
an
am.
old book, right. So you might not know it because it's a pretty old book,
Mm.
but he says Harry's Game did such a fabulous job of depicting Belfast. He said, you smell
Okay.
Belfast, you see it. He said, I want you to rewrite the Damascus cover and do that for Damascus.
Mm.
And I did. And then later it became kind of a signature of all my books that they had very great and detailed description of the cities they resided in.
Okay.
In particular, the Syrian Sunset takes place mostly in Damascus, with some of it in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the things people have liked about the novels.
Yeah, yeah. So that was a good tip from that editor then.
I think it changed my writing life,
Yeah.
because it taught me, and he handed me a copy of the book. I don't remember if he published it or not, or he got it for me,
Mm.
but literally right on the spot, he said, read this,
Read it.
and I want you to do for Damascus what he did for Belfast.
Fair. I'll have to read this now. This is interesting to me. Obviously, I live, 15 minutes from Belfast, so that's very interesting.
Yes, it made me, well, I can hear your accent. I got accustomed to it a little bit from Jonathan Rhys Meyers
Mm.
on the set, so I recognized it pretty rapidly.
Well, I loved reading. So I've read Syrian Sunset this week, and I loved reading it. And I should say that, yeah, we're dealing with war, of course. It's interesting that we get some, political aspect, especially sort of near the end. We see like Obama appearing. They talk about our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, who coincidentally is now our Foreign Affairs Minister again. And we get some of the political aspect as well as the war aspect, because of course those go hand in hand. But we get some human aspect as well. When we have asking people, would you like to join the resistance? And seeing, with the one girl, is it Lilia? And then also, of course, when Saeed tells his son, his kind of adopted son, well, your parents died here, and he says, well, were you actually responsible for that? And he says, well, I wasn't responsible necessarily, but I was still part of the whole thing. I was there, I was involved. I didn't
Yeah,
give the order.
I have someone writing a film treatment. It doesn't mean we have a film deal.
Mm,
That's just, and he called me up a couple of weeks ago and he said, I started crying when I read that scene.
that bit, yeah, that's
You
my
know,
most memorable scene, I think, from the
yes,
book. Yeah.
yes. So it's interesting to me. I probably have to go back and reread it because now I've had two people say to me that this particular scene
Yeah.
particularly struck them.
And you feel bad for the boy because there's that bit where he kind of says, well, yeah, you looked after me and you helped me. Was it just because you then wanted to kind of use me as a tool? And the answer is kind of sort of, yeah, like
Both. I think
both.
the
Like I
answer is
also do
both.
love you, but yeah.
Yes, and that's how I conceived it. I can't tell you what the reason was, but I wanted it to be that his father is a head of military intelligence, and he both had a long-term plan to use his son to insinuate him in the Syrian chemical
Hmm.
weapons industry. But I have a son who's now 30. And a lot of the template for the love between them, even some of the scenes are exactly replicated from things my son and I said to each
Right.
other,
Okay.
although my son said them to me in New Mexico on vacation and
Okay.
not
Slightly different setting,
yes,
but
but the relationship is the same.
hmm.
So he's not, as a main character, pure as the driven snow. He did believe he was willing to use his son for what he thought was a greater good.
Yeah.
And that's up to, I guess, the reader to say how you feel about that. But
Mm.
some person I wrote a review and they said, excuse me, I read a review and they said it took a little while to warm up to the
Mm.
father because of that. But
A
after
little
a
bit.
while, they came to care about him very much.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a fair comment, actually. And it's interesting as well when we talk about, the red kind of Obama's red lines and this type of stuff. and the influence that the West has had, which I would argue is mostly been negative. I mean, I don't want I don't want to turn it into a political discussion. I want to kind of stick with the book, but it is a shame to see the amount of destabilization of the Middle East that has happened,
Right. People
from
didn't step
the
in to help
West.
these people.
Yeah.
And Obama, I think Obama, all that stuff is historically accurate, both the
Yeah, yeah.
Obama scenes and the David Cameron scenes. And I think the British Parliament, Cameron's party, some of, I think 13 people broke ranks to go to vote against helping
Mm,
Syria because they were angry at Tony Blair following George Bush
yeah.
into Iraq, which was a huge blunder.
Sure.
So, in one of these terrible moments of history, the West should not have gone into Iraq and left that alone. And because they did and didn't want to face another something that didn't work, they refused to go into Syria where they should have.
So
And
they
they
should have
probably
done
could
it.
have gone in with cruise missiles without boots on the grounds and taken out Assad's air force and the helicopter gunships that were killing so many civilians. But everybody lacked the will because they were looking behind them and not wanting another disaster. And Iraq clearly was a disaster for everyone.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. Well, let me ask you then, now that this one came out actually over a little bit over a year ago, what's next? Are you working on something
Well,
else?
two things. One is uh, I hired a Jordanian screenwriter who wrote and directed an Emmy award winning small film to do a treatment and then a screenplay. And
Hmm.
I've just now started a novel about Gaza
Okay,
with the
sure.
same characters as the Syrian Sunset. So
Ah.
it's not so much a sequel. A lot of my books are have some repeating characters.
Hmm.
Shy from the Syrian Sunset appears in earlier books, but they're all standalones. In other words,
Sure,
that you don't
sure.
have to have read them or in any order. It just becomes a sequel or a
Mm.
prequel or whatever. And the Syrian Sunset is the most standalone. It's really unrelated completely to the other
Okay.
novels. So I would like to do something about Gaza. I've been highly frustrated by the barbarity on both sides, which
Yeah.
means the Hamas attack and the just the abusing of women and slicing people up, and the Israeli overreaction of now killing upwards of 10,000 children in Gaza and almost without a tear, almost without, they're so traumatized. But this doesn't give them justification to do this.
Of course. So this would be you
So,
writing a novel that's, yeah, I mean, it's still set in the Middle East. It's still similar vein to your other stuff, but actually very, very current.
yes, it took me a long time to get started,
Mm.
partially because events were developing on the ground so fast, and partially because I was just kind of overwhelmed. That's not the right word. Depressed is maybe
But
closer at
yeah,
the amount of killing on
yeah,
both sides.
I know.
These people are just involved in a tit for tat kind of mentality rather than looking for solutions.
Yeah.
So now I'm about 20 pages into it, and hopefully I have the direction to keep going.
Hopefully, hopefully. Well, one or two final questions before I let you go. The first one is, do you want to tell people where they can get the book or plug your website or something like that?
My website, there's a lot of interviews like about, my rest and rush in that. It's very simple. It's Howard Kaplan, if you have the spelling of my name,
Mm-hmm.
books, howardkaplanbooks.com.
Cool. I'll put a link
And
as
the,
well in the show notes.
yes, and the best place to find them are on Amazon. I mean, we're
Fantastic.
just in a new world, where I can do a Zoom to you from Los Angeles and you could, click and you'll have the book in a day or
Yeah.
the Kindle immediately.
It's
Uh,
super convenient if I don't know. I'm a bit of a, technophobe a little bit. I find it a bit dystopian, despite the fact that it's also massively convenient. So
Yes, I think that's the struggle. But for authors, you're kind of, people love the purity of trying to buy books at independent bookstores. But in truth, the mammoth amount of sales are from Amazon.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
it's just the world that we're in.
So
And
let me
so
ask you, Howard, one final question. We ask this to every author who comes on the show. If there's any existing book that you wish you had been the person to write, what would it be?
I would say that would be Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the Le Carre novel. I think that's the best of all his many
Mm,
brilliant books. And I've read it a few times and seen the various TV adaptations. I think the old one was with Alec Guinness.
hmm.
But I don't. How can I say this? I don't feel frustrated that I can't write at that level. Um, I am content with the work that I've done and the kind of writing that I've done.
Absolutely.
And I acknowledge that there are some people who are just head and shoulders over almost everybody else. And
Mm,
certainly in the serious thriller business, which is what I write, there's nothing better than Le Carre. There's Graham Greene, there's other people, but there's still Le Carre at the top of the heap.
sure. Well, Howard, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for calling in. I love the book, as I say. I'll put a link to your website in the show notes, and hopefully we'll get a few more people to go and check it out.
Thank you so much. I
No problem.
appreciate your
Thanks.
time.
Take
Bye bye.
care.